Thanks very much for having us today. I'm now concerned, listening out for that door slamming for the first person to leave and then get fed up and bored. My name's Tim Moss. I have a normal day job working in Leeds, but outside of that, I run a website called The Next Challenge, where I encourage other people to live adventurously and try to give them help and advice to do so. And I run an annual grant where any money that I get through advertising on my website, I give away to people who apply to me with ideas for adventures, people who've not done expeditions and things like this before, try and give them a helping hand. And my wife, Laura, organises another cycling festival called the Cycle Touring Festival, all about doing bike trips which are overnight, cycle, sleep, repeat, anything that fits that criteria. It's a long weekend over in Clitheroe in May every year. She's also a director of an organisation called the Adventure Syndicate, which aims to get more women and girls involved in cycling and pushing what they think they're capable of. So as I mentioned, we both work in Leeds. We live in Guiseley. About an hour ago, we were sat at our desks like good worker bees, typing away on something boring. And I mentioned that because somebody asked a moment ago if we're touring the country giving this talk, and sounds lovely, but no, we're not. We've only ever spoken about our cycling trip twice before, once at the festival that Laura organises and once in my office. So this is something fairly novel for us still. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Laura, who's going to start and tell you a little bit about this big cycling trip that we went on.
How do I move slides on?
Just right.
Hello. So, Tim and I are married, as you might have guessed, and we met about 10 years ago in London. The first date we had was swimming in a lake in November. So adventure has kind of defined who we are individually and together ever since we first met. And on that first date in the lake in November, we made a joke about, wouldn't you like to cycle around the world one day? And both of us agreed that it would be fantastic to get on our bikes and just cycle east. And we couldn't, for various reasons, do that at the time. I'm a solicitor in my day job, and I had to qualify first and foremost. I don't think my employer would have taken that kindly to me jetting off. But we did manage to fit in lots of smaller adventures. So within a year of meeting, we'd managed to run the length of all the tube lines in London. We'd walked across the desert in Oman. We walked across Patagonia. We'd done various cycling trips. So we really did cram the adventures into our annual leave. But we kept coming back to this idea of getting on our bikes and going east. And I worked right in the heart of the city at the time, and I used to go past, for those of you who know London, I used to go past the Elephant and Castle roundabout on my way in as I commuted to the city from South London. And it signposted Dover, and the urge every day to go right and go towards Dover was really hard to fight. And one day eventually we thought, well, we have to just do it. So we started planning this trip and gathering kit together and getting hold of a couple of bikes that we thought would be suitable for this trip. And then we did a training trip to Cornwall. And the plan was to cycle from the Scilly Islands to the Shetland Islands. And how many people here have cycled in Cornwall? And would you agree that it's the most mountainous country in the world? It comes up at the Cycle Touring Festival every year that it's the best and worst place in the country to cycle, because it's just so hilly, and it's not like Yorkshire or places like the Lake District where you go up a long ascent and then down, down, down. It's short, sharp. So it's really relentless. It's pretty awful, but beautiful. So we were cycling through Cornwall, and this was a couple of days into this training trip we did. And Tim had just broken the world record for the longest distance cycled by rickshaw, which is a niche record. but believe it or not, there is a Guinness World Record for that, and he did hold that record for a while. So he was really fit, is what I'm trying to say, really. And we were cycling through Cornwall, and I was in front and pedalling along. And then I realised he wasn't behind me, and I turned round, and he was quite far back. And I thought, gosh, that's odd, that's really unusual, because he's, particularly at the time, he was much fitter than me, so he'd usually be in front. And so I stopped and waited for him to catch up, and this kept happening over the course of the day. And I thought, there's something really not right here. And then we got to a field, and he said, I just have to stop. And at that point, I will let him take over.
My muscles weren't aching. There wasn't any of that lactic acid you get going up a hill. That wasn't the problem. My heart wasn't really pounding particularly either, and there was still air in my lungs. I just couldn't will my legs to go around for some reason, so I just got off and pushed. And then, as Laura said, we stopped in a field, and we were supposed to be camping that evening. And usually sleeping under the stars is a real privilege to me. I love it. I really look forward to any opportunity to do it. But for some reason that evening I couldn't face it. But the alternative would have been to find a hotel and pay for that, and that seemed like quitting. And you can't do that on the first day. How are we ever going to get around the world if we have to pay for a hotel every night? And now, looking back a few years, I can sort of articulate that. I can realise what was going on in my head. Don't quit, can't face camping, don't want to pay for a hotel, just can't bring myself to sleep outside. But at the time, I wasn't saying anything. I was just sat on the floor quietly whilst Laura was trying to coax something out of me, and eventually said, just enough of this, let's just get a hotel. The next day, carried on cycling. We'd only got a few miles to a town. I was like, I've got to stop. Laura, knowing me well, went to Greg's to get me a pasty, knowing that low blood sugar is often the source of the problem. But this time it was something more than that. When she got back, I was just sat on the floor with my head in my hands crying, and she said, what's wrong? I said, I don't know, but I need to go home. Now, normally, I prided myself on never giving up. I was the guy that when I was out walking with my friends, I'd be, come on, let's do a few more miles before it gets dark. When I was in a race, I'd push. Even when you're hurting in those final minutes, those final miles, just push and keep going. And to give an example of that, there's a cycle loop near our house that I used to do every morning before going to work. It was about 4 or 5 miles, and I used to do like a time trial around it. I'd be racing to try and get a personal best, not against anyone else, just against myself. And I'd go at it so hard that one day I collapsed at the end of it with a bright red face, bike on the floor, just lying on the grass verge, when a car pulled up and said, are you all right, mate? And I said, all right, I'm more than all right, I just got a PB. So that's what I was normally like. So this had come, this not being able to go up a hill and going home on the first day had come as a bit of a surprise. But I think I'd started to question what the point of riding my bike in circles to beat my own time was, and what the purpose of riding a bike from the Scilly Isles to the Shetlands, what was the point in that? In fact, what was the point in riding a bike at all? I think part of the problem is that I used to work at home on my own, so I didn't have any interactions with people. I wasn't earning a lot of money, and it was all eating away at my esteem. My self-esteem was quite low. And it came to a bit of a climax one day. Laura and I were just in the kitchen talking about something boring and mundane, trying to decide what we were going to do that day, and it all just got a bit much for me. So I decided I'd leave the kitchen. I found myself walking into the bedroom, and I saw a little dark corner behind the bed, so I just went and sat in that, and I just wanted to shut out all this noise, all these decisions. So I curled up into a ball, and I closed my eyes and put my fingers in my ears as hard as I could. I just thought, if I can make this go away, then everything's going to be better. And it worked. It was just blissful relief. All the problems just seemed to disappear, except, of course, that at some point Laura came into the bedroom and found her husband sat on the floor, curled up in a ball, rocking back and forth. And what was odd was that what must have been a horrible shock to her the first time around, it soon became quite normalised. My friends would come round for a barbecue, and I'd hide behind the bed, and they'd be like, is Tim going to come out and play? And no, he might be out in a minute. Or my parents would come round, and they'd have to come into the bedroom, and I'd be sitting on the floor looking up, and I'm fine, Mum, yeah, thanks. And Laura would come and bring my tea and serve it to me whilst I sat on the floor. So it sort of went from being tragic to being quite almost comic, really. So eventually we realised there was something wrong. So I went to the doctor, and I wasn't at all surprised to learn that I had depression. But I really pressed him on the physical. I was like, well, I understand I've got this mental problem, but why can't I ride my bike up hills anymore? Why, when I go running, do I stop at the end of the first block and then end up walking all the rest of the way? And he said, you don't understand, Tim, that's the depression too. So there was a little bit more tragic comedy following on from that, because despite the fact that I couldn't ride my bike up a hill and I could barely leave the house sometimes, I was still convinced that we were going to cycle around the world. Don't worry, get me on my bike and I'll be fine. Leave London, I'll be fine. But thankfully, Laura helped me realise that we had more of a problem. So we put our plans on hold. I got help with a lot of patience and support from Laura, and a year later we packed our bags, went back to Cornwall, cycled all the way to Scotland without any problems, and then set off once again to cycle around the world.
So it's quite a tough job following Tim when he does that bit. It gets a bit more cheerful from now on in. So we gathered a group of friends together because we thought Cycling is generally more fun with friends. I'm impressed by how many people are in matching jerseys tonight, which emphasises that point. And we met at Hampton Court down in London, where we were living at the time, and set off to go to Paris. And really, I really like this picture because this really sums up what our whole journey was about. It was basically nothing to do with cycling. It was about the people that we met on the way. Cycling just happened to be the form of transport that we used, albeit, to me, the perfect form of transport for getting from A to B, particularly for doing journeys of one night or more, which is what I define cycle touring as. There's something about the bike, I think, and I know I'm preaching to the converted, but which really opens the world up to you. And it's something I've thought about a lot before. I don't know if it's that it's the speed that you travel at, which makes you see the world more than if you're in a car. I don't know if it's that you're very vulnerable on a bike, so people take pity on you. Or I don't know if it's because you spend all your time in what I call the in-between places. So if you go backpacking or on a normal package holiday, you kind of get teleported from one tourist spot to another tourist spot. Whereas on a bike, you spend your entire time getting from A to B. It's almost nothing about those tourist spots. But it really means that you see another side to the world and another side to the people of the world. And that's what this talk is about. And Tim's written a book about the trip, which we've got here, and that's what the book is about. It's not about the cycling, I'm afraid to tell you. It's about the people that we met that the bike enabled us to meet. So we gathered with this lot at Hampton Court down in London, and we carried on to Paris. Most of them came with us to Paris, and then we stayed with some friends who live near Paris, and then we set off on our own, just the two of us, from that point onwards. And we chased the summer south, so it was August when we set off in 2013, and we followed the season, followed the summer down towards the Alps, crossed over the Alps, and then down the coast of Croatia. And it was very beautiful, and the blackberries remained in season from the date we set off right up until about October time. And eventually we reached Albania. And Albania was it really marked a turning point in our journey, in that we went from Western Europe to a very different Europe, very different to the Europe we knew. And I'll hand over to Tim again at that point.
Got to Albania, and Albania was like nowhere else. First thing that greeted us was a cow in the road, followed by 2 pigs, a chicken and a goat. The second thing that greeted us were roads like this. I'm not going to complain, we had a couple of months of just stunning weather, but Albania was doing its best to make up for it in a single day with the most horrendous downpour of our trip so far. We were slogging our way up a hill, and after a couple of hours of this, I just thought, enough's enough, we're calling it a day. I saw a building up ahead with a workshop, and there's a little guy sitting in it. I turned to Laura and I said, let's try the magic letter. Magic letter is a letter that works magic. Translated into the local language, it says something along the lines of, hello, we're Tim and Laura, we've cycled X thousand miles from the UK, is there somewhere safe that we can sleep? We'd used it already a couple of times to magical effect. You hold it up and people look at you like you're crazy when you turn up on your bike and looking all grubby, and as soon as they read this letter, I think they sense the bit of the vulnerability, and all you're asking for is a patch of grass to pitch a tent on, and they help out. So I thought, this little old guy, he's going to help us out. Held up my magic letter, he took one look at it, smiled at me, shook his head. I was like, oh, okay, fair enough, that's fine. But then he gestured for us to sit down, and we're sitting in his workshop, just water dripping onto the cold stone floor, and he hands us 2 bottles of water. I was like, mate, the last thing we need right now is more water. But it was a nice gesture, and we thought we'd try and neck it and quickly get going, because it was wet and dark, starting to get dark. We wanted to find somewhere else we could sleep. Then he chops a pomegranate in half and hands it to us, and again, pomegranate's nice and it's a lovely gesture, but it takes ages to eat a pomegranate, and I'm freezing cold and just dripping on the floor. We keep trying to gesture, is there anywhere? We just got a tent, could we just sleep here? There was a little sheltered bit outside his house, we could shelter from the rain. He just kept shaking his head. Eventually, a young girl comes through the door who speaks fluent English and explains to us that her uncle is very happy for us to sleep outside and has been trying to explain as much to us through the Albanian custom of shaking his head to mean yes. And you couldn't make it up. It's a true story. Shake the head for yes and nod for no. In fact, he said, rather than sleep outside, he'd far rather that we came inside the house. So We go inside, we're treated to showers and put on some dry clothes and nice and warm, and all the family comes round, and family have been phoned up and come round from miles around. There's one guy who's missed his own son's first birthday to meet the crazy English guys on their bikes. And we're sitting in the living room together, and the girl's translating messages for us, asking us lots of things about ourselves. And at one point, it's okay, it's going the right way. It's going the right way. At one point, I can see that the girl's cousin keeps nudging her and whispering something and looking at Laura and pointing, and the girl's looking quite shy. I said, don't worry, it's okay, translate what he's asking. And he says, my cousin wants to say to you, Laura, that you have very beautiful eyes. And I was like, oh, wow, that's very nice. And a few minutes later, he's nudging her again, and he's looking at me and pointing, and I'm thinking, what is it? What is it about me? Is it the eyes? Is the guns? What's this guy like? I said, don't be shy. Let him speak. So she translates and says, my cousin asks, in your country, can they not cure baldness either? So there was that. So we were put up for the night, had a lovely evening. We were very well fed, and in the morning we tried to sort of pack up early, not to abuse the hospitality too much. They've been so kind. So we got outside, packed our bags, and we just asked to wait a few minutes whilst the girl was brought back to translate for us one more time. She was missing school for it, so we felt especially bad. But when she arrived, we asked her to translate one more message and say, can you please tell your mum that she's got the most kind, intelligent and thoughtful daughter. So she was quite embarrassed, but she translated the message, and she said, can I just pass on one last message to you? You are absolutely the best people I've ever met. And then she said, have you enjoyed your stay? To which I shook my head.
So Albania led us eventually to Turkey, and Turkey again marked another turning point in our journey, in that it went from being summer to winter very quickly, almost overnight. We were very lucky that my parents came and met us in Istanbul with lots of winter clothing, so we had big thick boots from Costco and huge gloves and extra sleeping bags and so on, because we were intending to camp all the way. But you can see the snowfall was pretty extreme, and it was minus 15 or minus 20 in total it ended up being about 3 months of winter, so it was really enjoyable but also slightly grim. We've lived in the Middle East together before, so we were familiar with this part of the world, but for those of you who aren't familiar with this part of the world, Turkey and the Middle East it's the most hospitable part of the world that we've ever been to. We were invited in all the time, and actually to illustrate that, in 7 weeks in Turkey, I said we were intending to camp. We actually used the tent twice. Every other night we got invited into people's homes. We carried food with us to cook for evening meals, but ended up throwing it away because people just kept feeding us whether we wanted it or not. And everybody from private families to kebab shop owners, it was great. Always difficult to know how to respond to that level of hospitality, and being very English, it made us very awkward, but we started carrying gifts rather than food to give to people when they fed us or offered us a bed. So we crossed the Turkish winter, entered Georgia, had Christmas and New Year in Georgia and Armenia, and then the next big country on our list was Iran. And we were really excited about going to Iran because we've got friends who've travelled there, we've got a good friend who's married to an Iranian girl, so we felt that we'd heard a lot about the country. But obviously the media headlines that you get in this country made us slightly nervous. Of course they would do. But we were prepared to have a very open mind. We crossed into Iran in early February, and it's a really fascinating place to travel. As a woman, I had to cover up. So you can see here, I had to wear clothing down to my wrists, and I had to cover my legs down to my ankles. And I had to wear loose clothing, and I had to wear a headscarf all the time, which actually, because it was still minus 15 degrees, it was fine. I was able to just keep layering, keep my layers on at all times. Iran obviously has sanctions against it, which we hear a lot about in this country. For us on a day-to-day level, that meant that we had to carry all our cash with us because they're not part of the international ATM network. So any money that we wanted to spend in the country, we took with us. So we had all these US dollars hidden everywhere, from our bum bags, our handlebars, our seat posts, everywhere you could possibly imagine. We had a few dollars stashed away. Actually, it was also the safest, or it felt to be the safest country we went to, so I think we went over the top in trying to hide this money everywhere, because I think no one would ever have nicked it from us anyway. The sanctions also meant that there haven't been any new car parts in Iran for a long time, probably since the 1979 revolution. So all the cars were really old, and any time you went into a city, the pollution was just dreadful, because it was like cycling in the 1970s, I imagine, must have been here. So there's lots of reasons why it was an interesting place to be. The one defining feature above all, though, and I've already said the Middle East itself is a hospitable part of the world, nowhere more so was that the case than Iran. It was just unbelievable. We were there for just over a month, and we were just constantly invited in. We arrived in the country at 2 a.m, and at about 2:10 a.m, someone was following us down a dark street, trying to persuade us to go back to his house for a cup of tea. He had his wife and his son in the car, and he wanted to take us home to sort of show us his house. And we were like, no, it's 2 a.m, we need to go and find somewhere to sleep. So it really was absurd levels of hospitality. We started to get a bit blasé about it. In fact, it was this day, we were cycling along and we were taking some photographs, and we were stopped by the police. It was a fairly regular occurrence that we'd be stopped by the police because they wanted to check our visas and so on. These guys in particular stopped us for a chat. I mean, he's got his hand up because he's stopping us from filming him. So he was happy for us to be there and take photographs, but he drew the line at being filmed, which actually is fair enough. But they stopped us and started having a chat. And neither me nor Tim know very much about football. We have followed the World Cup, but we're not good on football. And actually, our knowledge, before the World Cup this time, our knowledge of football dates from the Euro 96 squad and perhaps Manchester United players in the late 90s. But that didn't matter, actually, because any time we met people in any country around the world, we could just recite Man United players from the late 90s and people were up for it. So we did the same with these guys. They stopped us and we started saying, oh, Ryan, you know, I'm from Bolton originally, so I usually tell people I'm from Manchester when I'm abroad, and that always provokes a reaction. Oh, Manchester United. So we'd say David Beckham, Ryan Giggs, and we'd go through the list that we usually did and do lots of thumbs up. So we had this interaction with these fellas, and then they drove off. And then 5 minutes later, they came back very sheepishly and asked to see our passports because they'd got so caught up with the joy of Manchester United in the 90s that they'd forgotten why they'd stopped us in the first place. So we carried on cycling down the road after we'd had this interaction with them. And we started noticing it was a very flat plain. Iran's a beautiful country, and there's lots of big mountains, but between the mountain chains, there's lots of big gravel plains. So we were in one of these gravel plains. And so we could see quite a long way. We could probably see 10, 15 miles. And we started noticing all the way across, there were these big chunks of machinery. And as we grew close to them, we realised they were anti-aircraft missiles. And Tim used to be big into computer games, and it was him that recognised them from computer games he played as a kid. He said, I know them from whatever daft game it was that he played as a child. And we thought, gosh, this is interesting. And then another police car caught up with us and beckoned us to follow him. So we followed him for a way down the road. He was driving very slowly for us. And eventually he turned off into a compound. And it was getting fairly dark at this point. So we followed him into this compound, and the gate shut behind us. And we thought, gosh, this is a bit slightly worrying. And various guards appeared and started talking to us, and we started talking to them about Manchester United players because that's our default. And it was all very friendly. And Tim and I know each other very well, and we caught each other's eye. And I knew that because it was going dark, we both knew that the other person was thinking, I wonder if we could camp here. Should we ask? So we sort of started making the international symbol for tent and sleeping, and sort of nodding, and they were all very smiley. And then they burst out laughing and said, of course you can't camp here, this is a military compound. And we were like, fair enough. And so even Iranian hospitality, fortunately perhaps, has its limits, but we got so comfortable by that point to expecting to be offered a bed anywhere that we just thought that would be the case. Even in this military compound. It was only later on, we carried on up the road, they let us out of the lock gates, carried on to the nearest town, and the nearest town was called Natanz. And for those of you who know, Natanz is the biggest nuclear enrichment site in Iran. It's just been in the news recently, actually. And that was the compound that we'd been led into. It was the main nuclear enrichment site in Iran. So no wonder they'd wanted to check us out and check our visas, and no wonder there were anti-aircraft missiles everywhere. But it was just, it wasn't a place to be scared of at all. It was a really fantastic country where people were just like you and me, as often is the case. So from Iran, we took a ferry to
the Emirates to Dubai, and the contrast between those two countries could not be greater. We've gone, as Laura's just described, from a country behind the sanctions, behind the curve of international development, to a nation at its shining zenith, just picturesque, big glass shiny buildings everywhere, brand new cars, lots of smooth tarmac roads, and everyone driving very fast. And the only thing that was slightly out of place was the two grubby cyclists that just rolled off the ferry. So we crossed the UAE and then we flew to India. The reason for the flight was we had to go around Pakistan. The area we would have visited was too dangerous at the time, so we had to get on a plane. Now, India, 1.4 billion people, set to become the most populous country in the world any day now. Bicycles everywhere, cyclists everywhere, but could we find a host? Could we heck? Now, I don't know if anyone here has heard of warm showers. So for those that haven't heard of it, it's a hospitality network for cyclists. So whatever country in the world you're in, you can go and look at a map and find a cyclist that lives nearby who might offer to put you up for the night or cook you a meal. And every country we've been to, lots of people, as we described, just took us in at the drop of a hat when they saw us. Sometimes we'd arrange with people in advance. So when we looked through on the map in India, all these people, all these cyclists, there was just one guy. His name was Hemant, and he lived in Jaipur, the pink city. And his profile on this hospitality network said that he'd been on 3 big cycle trips. And as far as I was concerned, he was the most experienced cycle tourist in India. So when we knocked on his door and a balding, pot-bellied, gangly man walks out, I was thinking, is this our guy? And I thought, don't judge. Cycle tourists come in all shapes and sizes. But the first thing he asked us to do is fix a puncture on his bike. I'm like, of course, yeah, we're only too happy. But Hammond, did he not get a puncture at all when he cycled across Australia? He said, yeah, I did, but I just pushed to the nearest bike shop. I was like, oh, okay, well, fair enough. How far was that, Hammond? 100 miles. Right, okay, so he's pushed his bike 100 miles. He didn't know how to change a tyre. Cyclists are often modest. Oh, I don't know anything about bikes. I'm not very good at mechanics. But this guy really didn't know anything. So I was intrigued. Now I wanted to ask a few more questions. So one of them I said to him, when you cycled across South Korea, did you carry a tent or did you stay in hotels? And he said neither. I just slept on picnic benches. Oh, all right, okay, right. Slept on picnic benches. What did you do when it rained? And he just looked at me like I was an idiot and said I slept underneath the picnic bench. So I loved this. We'd spent ages worrying about what kit that we should take on our trip. It was one of the biggest things we spent thinking about and planning in advance. And here's a guy who had no tent and no kit with him at all. If he had very little experience. He didn't even have a bike when he set off. He would just buy a cheap one when he got there and sell it on at the other end. And so there's this guy who's got no experience, no bike. Frankly, he's got no clue, but even he's cycled across the United States. And if he can do it, then truly anyone can cycle tall.
So we got pretty sick in India, and I know it's such a cliche, but we really did get quite sick. And Tim ended up in hospital, and a few months after being there, half of my hair fell out. So I think our bodies had just gone onto total shutdown because we had real difficulty getting food because we're in a very remote area of Rajasthan, and it was very beautiful. It was the desert, which we love being in the desert, but we just couldn't get enough to eat, and we couldn't get good quality food, and we were probably not being as careful as perhaps we should have been with water and so on. So we were a bit disheartened after a month of being poorly a lot. So Hemant actually recommended South Korea as the world's greatest cycle touring destination. And the reason being is that South Korea, a few years ago, about 6 years ago, they redid the whole network of rivers and they built lots of dams. And as a bit of a PR stunt alongside this huge redevelopment project, they built bicycle paths along all of the rivers. It's called the Four Rivers Bike Path. And they've installed red phone boxes all the way along the route, and you can get a passport at the beginning in Seoul, and then you can get the passport stamped in all of the red phone boxes on your way. And if you complete all the routes, you get a medal, and if you complete one route, you get a certificate. And we're suckers for any gimmick like that. We're suckers for it. So we thought this sounds great, and we managed to find good cheap flights from Delhi. So after a month of not being very well, we decided to hot-foot it over to South Korea on Hemant's suggestion, which is what we did. And we had a great 2 weeks. basically hanging out in the sunshine, sleeping under pagodas, swimming in the river, and having a very nice, what felt like a holiday within a holiday. After Korea, we then got the ferry over to Japan, and this was totally not what we'd planned. We were going to go across, actually, originally we were going across Central Asia, but then it was going to be India and China and all sorts. We found ourselves in Korea and Japan without intending to, really. But it was a great experience. And Japan was the one country that we thought, after at this point, we were probably about 8 or 9 months in, and so far on our journey, we've been offered hospitality everywhere, but quite a lot of people had warned us that in Japan, people are much more reserved, and that we were unlikely to be invited into places because of the national character, whatever that means, is about reserve and formality. On our very first night, these guys invited us in. So it was a load of rubbish, actually, and we were invited in all the way throughout the country. She was a tulip farmer, I can't remember what he did, a businessman of some sort, and they took us out for dinner and let us sleep in their amazing traditional Japanese house with the sliding walls and so on. And this happened consistently throughout our time there. One night is particularly memorable because we were caught in a very bad thunderstorm and we were cycling along like drowned rats, having a fairly miserable time. And this guy stopped and flagged us down and jumped out of his car, and he was really enthusiastic and beckoned us to follow him in his car. So he drove slowly through the suburbs and we followed him on our bikes. And when we got to his house, he explained that not only was he a very generous person who was going to look out for cycle tourists, he was also a chef. And if there's one thing better than someone who's going to invite you home, it's a chef who's going to invite you home. And he was obviously it's always a bit awkward when you go into someone's house and you don't really share a common language. I mean, we're pretty used to it now, but it was definitely a slight awkwardness. And he was obviously feeling this more than most. So he sat us down in his living room and put Despicable Me on for us because it was clearly he wanted to celebrate English culture or something, I'm not sure. But it was quite a surreal scene while he cooked us this amazing Wagyu steak and we watched Despicable Me, but it felt like we were his kids for that night. His wife eventually came home, and the two of them proceeded to have quite a lot to drink, and we had perhaps a beer, but the two of them got increasingly merry over the course of the evening, and his enthusiasm grew ever and ever greater, particularly for English culture. And at one point he disappeared off out of the room and then returned wearing some bright starry sunglasses and his daughter's tight spangly Union Jack t-shirt, singing Goodbye England's Rose. Said Elton John, Elton John. So we, it's not the first time that we've questioned our sanity about going home with just anybody we meet on the street, but actually we weren't murdered in the night as we thought we might be. It was actually a great experience, and he left us some donuts out when he left in the morning for breakfast, so it turned out okay, and we knew it'd be a good story when we got home.
So from Japan, we got our focus back and headed to Southeast Asia, where we were once again greeted by animals in the road, which we'd not had too much of since Albania, and we were greeted by the same amount of heat we had back in India, except now it was combined with humidity. So it was tough going, saddle soreness and struggling to sleep in a tent, but beyond that, it was a wonderful place to be touring, so different from everywhere else that we'd been, and neither of us had travelled to that region before, so it was eye-opening. Now, we'd learned by this point that wherever you go, people tell you that the next country's going to be dangerous. They warn you. Laura's mum, before we left home, she said you can't go to any countries that end in Stan because they're all the dangerous ones. You can't go to anywhere ending in Stan. People always warn you about terrorists in the next country, and people say daft things like don't try to ask to sleep in a top secret nuclear Iranian compound and stuff like that. But by this point, we'd learned pretty much that most of the time you could ignore the rumours. It's going to be fine. Except that we just crossed into Thailand a few days after there'd been a military coup, and in front of us there was a military checkpoint, and in front of the checkpoint there was a man with an automatic weapon at his chest holding his hand out for us to stop. He had a mask over his face, so I couldn't see what his expression was, but I imagined it was an angry scowl. So this guy's putting it out, his hand out to stop. We sort of smile and say Sawasdi, which I think is, I've got my language right, was hello. Just try and look, I don't know, non-threatening, non-terrorist-like. He's telling us to stop, and then we're staying where we are, and he's reaching into his truck, and I'm thinking, is he getting a gun? Is he getting some handcuffs? And he pulls out two objects, holds them up. They're sports drinks, and he points at the sun and says, very hot, gives us two drinks. So we're like, oh, and then we make the cycle off, and then he shouts, stop! And I think, oh no, something's gone wrong now. And then he says, Photo. Then that evening, we're looking around for somewhere to camp, and we see a temple, a Buddhist temple. And we thought we would try there because religious buildings, religious institutions and religious people all across the world had been really helpful to us so far. So we thought hopefully the Buddhists would be kind to us too. The difficulty was that I'm familiar with sort of the Christian cultures in Western Europe, and we've become very familiar with in lots of Muslim countries, but I didn't know anything about Buddhism. So I didn't really know what the customs were. I didn't know if it was okay wearing my shorts or if Laura had to cover up. So we were a little bit nervous, and we walked forward. In front of us there were these three young monks. They're in bright orange robes, head shaved, and none of them are speaking. I'm thinking, oh, have they got a vow of silence? They're going to be upset if I show them my letter and try to talk to them. And as I get closer, I suddenly realise that the reason they're not speaking is because they're all on their phones. They're all playing on Facebook. So that they've asked for some selfies, and they introduced us to the head honcho, and he asked for a photo too. And then he welcomes us into the temple, gives us our own room with air conditioning, sets us up to put our camping mats on the floor, gives us the code for temple Wi-Fi, and sets us up for the night. And you start to realise that people all over the world are all pretty similar. And the reason I mention this anecdote is just because religion often gets a bad press these days, and this trip was just a wonderful reminder that almost all religions involve some element of hospitality and kindness to strangers, and as a cycle tourist that's worth its weight in gold.
Southeast Asia took us to Australia, and Australia was originally the end of our journey. The plan had been to cycle to see Tim's brother, who lives in Melbourne, but we decided that we would change our plan. We kept changing our plan all the way through the journey, but we both had this real hankering to cycle home across America, so go coast to coast across North America. So we did a shorter journey in Australia than we'd originally planned, and it was great. We cycled on the Great Ocean Road from Adelaide to Melbourne, and you know, we'd spent a lot of time in the poorer countries of the world, and Australia was our first time in several months in a rich country, much more expensive than it is here. It certainly was at the time. But even in Australia, we got invited in all the time, and it was a good reminder that no matter what the social spectrum, whether it's rich or poor or black or white or religious or a-religious, people are still the same, actually, the world over. And so people still invited us in. And on the Great Ocean Road, in fact, it's a very exclusive area. The houses are real multi-million-pound mansions. And one couple took us in one night who had this beautiful, beautiful mansion overlooking the ocean with huge glass windows on the first floor. And we had our own wing. And they greeted us with a glass of red wine. And again, I think we had more steak that night as well. And but they were cyclists, so we had something in common. And this woman has now become my role model because her retirement plan, she'd recently retired, and her retirement plan involved cycling off-road across Australia, and she'd done it aged 60 odd. And I just thought she was fantastic because, you know, barrier, it didn't matter. One of the reasons I love cycle touring in particular is that, or cycling in general, is that people all look the same, and you can't prejudge anybody because you've all got Leica on, but one of you could be a millionaire and one of you could live on the streets, and it's a great leveler, I think, being on a bike. And it was a great reminder being on the Great Ocean Road that is the case. So after Australia, we had a nice month in Melbourne with Tim's brother and his wife, and then we had a quick trip to New Zealand before going across to America. New Zealand was just to visit a couple of friends who lived there, and we got there. I mean, it had been like this in Australia. It was quite nice weather, albeit quite chilly. And so we thought we'd be fine in New Zealand like that. And we went to sleep one night in brilliant sunshine, enjoying the sunset. And we woke up the next morning to thick snow. We were laying in our tent and it was all silent. We wondered why, and we unzipped it and there was thick snow everywhere. And we were about to cross the desert road on the North Island, which it's the highest road in the North Island of New Zealand. And they'd closed it because of snowfall. That didn't deter us. We decided to go up and have a look. When we got there was a news crew waiting for us. You can just about make out that the only footwear we had at the time with us was sandals, the sandals that Tim's got on, in fact. So we had to make do, and it was really cold, and they closed the road, and this news crew thought it was hilarious. So we had socks and sandals and plastic bags over our feet, and anything we could do to keep ourselves warm. And this news crew took great delight in pointing out the idiocy of the English. And for the rest of the time in New Zealand, we kept being spotted, so people would sort of laugh and point at us and say, "Oh, we've seen you on television, you idiots." And we're like, "Yes, that would be us." But actually, the reason why I like this story is because we sort of keep coming back to this point that anyone can do a cycle tour no matter what your experience or equipment. But this was a great example of where you just make do. Like, we didn't have our big winter boots, we didn't have ice tyres or anything like that, but we managed and we just got by with what we had, albeit perhaps not entirely comfortably, but we still managed to do it.
So after New Zealand, that left just one country, the USA. We were slightly short of time. We wanted to get back home to join our families for Christmas. It was also approaching winter time, so if we'd been in the north of the country, not only would it have been wider, the US is obviously like this sort of shape, it would also be really cold, and we'd had enough winter for one journey. So we decided to follow the Mexican border across the southern United States. When someone found out about that, a guy we just bumped into in the car park, that we're following the Mexican border, he said, "Have you got a gun?" I said, "No, we've not got a gun." He said, "Got pepper spray?" I was like, "No, we've not got pepper spray." And he said, "Well, I guess you just got God then." So that was what he thought about travelling along the Mexican border. But we had a great time. It was hot and dry and beautiful scenery, really stunning. And somewhere along the way, we got to the state of New Mexico, and we arranged a warm showers host, someone we could stay with for the night. We turn up at his house, nice little plot on the corner, little white picket fence, open the door, some little dogs come out, all very nice, all so normal. He seems friendly, welcomes us inside, and then I see something on the table, and I'm thinking, what the hell is that? I'm looking at Laura, we're mouthing like, is that? But Sam, our host, he's just chatting away. "Oh, how was your day? It was quite hot out there. Let me get you some iced tea." And I'm thinking, how can he be talking when there's all this stuff in front of us? What is going on? And eventually I just cracked and I said, "Sam, why is there a machine gun on the table?" He said, "What?" I said, why is there a machine gun? There's loads of guns. In fact, there's bullets everywhere. What's going on? He calmly explained to us that he's a federal agent. He works on border patrol, looking out for people crossing illegally, and he needed weapons for protection. And he just liked guns. So once we'd got into the topic, there was no stopping him. It was a tiny, tiny living room, but in the corner of it, he had a huge black safe, the size of a sort of like a walk-in fridge, if such a thing exists. This big, he punched in some numbers, opened it up, and that was just filled with an arsenal of different weapons. Now, we're British. We don't use guns. The only time we use guns, in fact, is to shoot clay pigeons on stag doos. So we were petrified. And he kept saying, like, "Look at this one, hold this one." And we were like, "No, I don't want to touch that thing. That's a weapon of war. That's a death machine." A few minutes later, we're like, "Oh, yeah, great. Yeah, this one's really cool. Yeah, check out the laser sight on this one, Law." And we sort of warmed to it as the evening went on. And eventually he convinced us that the following morning he'd go and take us out to a shooting range. We'd have a go with his guns. Waking up the following morning, we're feeling a little bit less sure about what we've just signed up to. We jump into his car as he puts all these shotguns and machine guns into the back of it, drives off into the desert at speed, stops in an abandoned car park in the middle of nowhere, and Laura and I are just thinking, is this the end? But he pulls the gun out the back and he doesn't point it at us, so I think we're doing okay. We all have a go, try all these things that it's sort of somewhere between really exciting and absolutely terrifying, good fun and pretty damn scary. And by the end of it, we can't really hear very much. My shoulder's aching from the kickback on his Italian shotgun. So we thank him for his hospitality, cycle off, and I'm thinking about it, and I turned to Laura, I was like, I'd never thought I'd be trying guns out. I never thought I'd do that. It's quite a scary thing to do, but if you're going to try it, I guess the best thing in the world that could happen is you do it with a member of law enforcement, a federal agent. She just looked at me and said, Did you see his badge? I didn't see a badge. He said, Did you see his ID? No, I didn't see an ID. Did you see anything to suggest that he was actually a member of law enforcement, or did you just see a lot of guns and a lot of tall stories? So who knows? We made it up. We escaped unscathed. So after that, we entered Texas, which was our third biggest country, bigger than almost everywhere else that we crossed on our entire journey. We went to Louisiana and New Orleans, or Norleans, as I'm told it's pronounced. We were travelling along the south coast, lots of the coastline that had been devastated by hurricanes Katrina and Rita, and stayed with people whose homes had been washed away and still were taking in strangers and hosting them. And shortly after that, we clocked up 13,000 miles on our little odometer, our cycle computer, on which we picked up from Decathlon for £10 back in France. And then after that, we reached the Atlantic Ocean.
We ended up back at Hampton Court Palace in the end. So as well as a talk about the world and its people, we learned quite a lot on this journey, as you might expect. And we think that you can distill what we learned into 3 messages, which we'd like to share with you, if you can indulge us for that. The first is that, as we keep saying, is that most people are good people. As we keep saying, we were hosted by people across the whole spectrum of society: black, white, Christian, no religion, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, everything, every religion and no religion that you can possibly imagine. Poor, rich, straight, gay, anybody you can imagine took us in. And again, like I said at the beginning, I think cycling is a great leveller, and it really makes you very vulnerable, and people seem to just take pity on you wherever you go, which is great if you don't have very much money to do a trip like this, which we didn't. We learned that being invited into a stranger's home isn't something to be scared about, it's something to be celebrated. And we learned not to prejudge people and to keep an open mind about what lay ahead of us, and not be scared of particular countries. We learned that there are stories behind it, there are humans behind the headlines, people just like me and you. The media doesn't tell a complete story about anywhere, and you have to go somewhere yourself to actually find out what a place is really like.
The second lesson is that all bad things come to an end. In cycling, as in life, good times are just around the corner. And whether that's a Turkish winter or hiding behind the bed, it's not long until those things too shall pass.
And then the third message, which I think is very apt for this cycling festival in Bradford, is that anyone can cycle. Anyone can cycle tour. Age doesn't have to be a barrier. So at the Cycle Touring Festival, one of our most popular speakers is a lady called Anne Wilson. And she's now in her early 60s. But when she was 59, she set off to cycle around the world. She'd done one cycle tour before in her life. I think she'd cycled from somewhere like Cumbria to Ipswich as a trial for this journey. She'd only actually started cycling in her 50s and then decided to go off on her own and do this amazing trip. And she, at the time, wasn't particularly fit. She says it was the greatest weight loss plan you could ever do. Her slides start off with her being a fairly normal size, and by the end she's minuscule. But she wasn't particularly fit, and she couldn't cycle over the Alps, so she pushed a bike for 8 hours over the Alps. I mean, she's just phenomenal. But if she can do it, really anyone can. Age doesn't have to be a barrier at all. Money doesn't have to be a barrier. So a good friend of ours, Tom Allen, he cycled from Land's End to John O'Groats a few years ago on a bike that he found in a skip with no money. He swapped skills all the way. So he didn't eat very much, I think. I think he was quite hungry at the end of the 3 weeks. But he offered to chop logs or paint a fence in return for meals and beds along the way. So money really doesn't have to be a barrier. Equipment doesn't have to be a barrier, you know. We managed to cycle across snowy New Zealand in our sandals, and Hemant managed to cycle across America, Australia and South Korea with no sleeping bag, tent and no idea how to mend a puncture. If he can do it, anyone can. Pregnancy doesn't have to be a barrier. The more observant among you may notice I'm rather large at the moment. Just a couple of weeks ago, Tim and I cycled 500 miles through Denmark, and I was 7 months pregnant at the time. So we went quite slowly and it was quite flat, but still managed to do it. And finally, experience doesn't have to be a barrier. So my first ever cycle tour was in my early 20s on my own on a mountain bike that I'd had since I was about 13, which was rubbish, and a pannier that I'd managed to find from Argos for about a tenner. And I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't really have a map of the country, but it was a great trip, and it sparked something in me which has carried on to this day. So really that final message is to say that anyone can cycle tour, and if all those people can do it, and if we can do it, then you definitely can as well.
No. I was pleasantly surprised by the scope of my beard. I never thought I'd be able to grow something like that. And once it had started, there's no way I was turning back. It didn't last long after I got home. It's not very practical. There's only so long you can live with that much food around your face. But while it was there, we very much enjoyed it. In fact, I took a photo every couple of weeks and then made it into like a little video, so you can see it over 20, 30 seconds do this and then trim back down again. We followed the sort of the south coast of Europe, didn't we, from going in our direction, going towards Greece. And we really enjoyed that. The Danube cycle route, if you go up, my geography's not great, but I'm pretty sure you could go north and then follow that west. People rave about that. But equally, yeah, going east, you'll start getting towards Turkey. It's a really hospitable and interesting place, quite cheap to travel as well, which is good for the cycle tourist. No, not really. The closest was probably in between Turkey and Iran. We went through Georgia and Armenia, and we just had about 2 months of winter by then. And I had a bit of a mental clash in my head, the same sort of thing, in that in my head I was the guy that pushed, who really liked the hardship, who would thrive on cycling in -20. And I think I did and do, but only for a couple of weeks at a time. And after 2 months of it, I was really tired, but I didn't want to admit that because I'd waited all my life to do this cycling trip. So there was a bit, I'd never had any of the symptoms like I did before we went off, but some of those similar feelings. And in the end, we actually got on there were other complications, but it was one of the reasons we got on a bus and skipped a bit of Armenia, was that I mentally couldn't face it. Turns out Iran was just as cold and hard, but I somehow alleviated a lot of it. So mercifully, yeah, on the trip, no, not much beyond that.
I am very fortunate to really like what I do. I work for charities and social enterprises, so I really like the clients I have, and I find it very rewarding. And I really missed working because I like using my brain and I like being busy all the time. So we had this absolutely fantastic trip, but actually both of us were quite ready to come home when we did come home. And I started work, I think we'd been back something like 10 days when I started at the new job. So it was a real quick transition. And I think probably it did take quite a long time, perhaps, to get it to get over being back. And I'm talking a couple of years of feeling a bit restless. But we've had we've been back 3.5 years, and we've had a really exciting few years in that Tim's changed jobs twice, and we've bought a house, and this is happening. And so it's not been as bad as I think some people find it, but certainly that's almost harder than going away in the first place, coming home.
And two things I would add. The first one is that what helped was that before we were living in London and we had some jobs, we didn't go away and then come back to the same place and the same jobs. I think that might have been a bit harder because we moved up here, which has been great. As Laura kindly suggested, yeah, I changed jobs. Before I used to work for myself at home, organising expeditions, which was really interesting, but led to some of these problems that I had. So again, having a new project, new career to get into, that sort of gave us a different focus. That's the main thing, really.
I think I can tell the worst day was, we often say that Iran was our favourite country to go through, but actually Iran was also my worst day, in that it was just so bitterly cold on one particular occasion, and we were cycling downhill quite fast, which, you know, is always going to be freezing on your feet. And we had these huge boots, but it just wasn't helping at all with my toes. And I was listening to History of the World by Andrew Marr at the time, and he was droning on about something, and it was quite boring, if I'm honest. And eventually because I was so cold, and there was these big massive lorries kept overtaking me really close, and I just got really angry and pulled my earphones out of my ears and shouted, "F Andrew Marr," and then God knows what the lorry drivers thought, but and then I burst into tears. And then eventually we got to a cafe, and bless the cafe owner, realised that I in particular was in a massive state, so brought out a gas stove for me to warm my toes over and defrost them. But it ended up being okay, but it was pretty grim for most of that day.
In terms of best days, it's really hard to pinpoint because there's so many really, really good days, and it's picking one out. But if I narrowed it down to two, it might be a boring answer, but I think the day we departed and the day we got back, because both times just surrounded by friends and family, all these people who've just come out of the woodwork, you haven't seen them for a while, and then seeing them come out to celebrate with you, either setting off on a big trip or coming back. It's just so heartwarming. It might be not a very exciting answer, having travelled the world, but that's probably the truth of it. In terms of timescale, we both knew
we'd agreed that we would be away for between a year and 2 years. And I think that helped with the transition coming home, in that we both knew that we didn't want to be one of these people who go away indefinitely. And we've got friends who really have, we've got a friend who's gone off for 7 years, and we've got people who are they're still pretty much wandering. So we knew that wasn't for us, but we wanted to be away for long enough that it made it worth quitting our jobs and giving up everything that we had in terms of our life. In terms of budget, we had a budget of we saved up before we went, and we each saved up about £5,000 for 16 months we were away in total. We didn't run out of money, but what happened was we started picking up bits of writing work on our way. So we wrote for Cycling UK and wrote for a couple of other cycling magazines, and I wrote something for a legal blog, and that helped us. Not necessarily helped us travel for longer, but helped make our life slightly more comfortable. So we had a luxury pot. So anytime we were having a bit of a rough day or it was freezing, we could pay for a hotel, and that came out of our luxury pot and didn't eat into our daily budget. So the work that we did contributed to the luxury pot more than anything. It made, particularly the journey across America where we were pushing it, and we crossed America in something like 2.5 months, and the days were quite long. So by the end of the day, actually, to be able to check into a motel every few nights was a real treat, and not have to worry about the money too much.
Yeah, we did set a budget in advance of roughly, we've got £7 between us per day in this country, and we'd take that much out of our wallet and put it in, came out of Laura's bulging wallet, came in my sparsely filled one, and that was our money for the day, and we would largely stick to that. And the whole trip, it's written down exactly in there, but it was about £6,000 each, and that includes every single penny that we spent. So flights, visas, accommodation, food. It works out as somewhere around less than £400 a month, maybe £350 a month each. So it was the cheapest we'd ever lived, and a lot less than even our rent alone would have been in London. So cycling can be very cheap. Well, I think the first thing to note is the planning. We sort of did on the kit. We planned reasonably well, but that's because I used to work in expeditions and I like kit. Beyond that, the planning sort of went along the lines of a world map and being like, we'll go through these countries here, and then we'd quickly check if we needed a visa in advance. And it's worth noting that there are only 2 or perhaps 3, if you're being picky, visas on our entire trip that we needed to book in advance. Everywhere else we just turned up at the gates, and either they let you in or you pay $10. Bits of kit that we really missed. I don't think there were lots of kit that we sent home over time that we didn't need. I think we both would have liked an altimeter and a thermometer, just so we could see how high we were and how cold it really was. But I don't think there were any key things that we missed out. And things that surprised us, I think the only thing that comes to mind is that you think about cycling around the world, or certainly I did, and I think about the physical challenge, but it was what we soon found after the first couple of weeks of all the excitement and new things going on, is that really a lot of the time you're spending 8 hours a day on a bike not talking to anyone. So there was the mental stimulation. So we started on quieter places. We just listened to audiobooks and, as Laura suggested, and podcasts to keep our minds active. And in fact, we did so much of it, it almost felt like we'd done a master's degree by the end, because you've got so little other mental stimulation. You can really focus, and all those big books you've been meaning to read for years, you're like, now's the time.
With just one headphone in.
Yeah, obviously, we would never dream of doing it cycling to work here, but when you're in the middle of the Australian outback, there's 1 car an hour and you've got one earphone, just Andrew Marr prattling on, it's not a big, not a big danger issue.
We were really lucky that Ridgeback gave us a couple of bikes, Ridgeback World Panoramas, which are proper steel touring bikes, and they're great, really, really good. I think I had a constant issue with my sizing and the shape, the fitting of it. So I think if I did a trip like this again, I would probably get a custom built bike, or I know a lot more now about my riding style. And you can see, I was looking at this picture while Tim was talking, that you can see how curved my back is in that picture. It's a really rubbish stance, and no wonder I had back trouble for quite a lot of the journey. Actually, when I got to New Zealand, I got someone to put me a riser stem thing on, and that made a big difference. Even now it makes a big difference, but I still think I would probably get a different bike if I did it again, whereas Tim was utterly happy with yours.
Yeah, I'm quite lucky in that I seem to be fairly insensitive to misfitting bikes, and and in terms of technical problems, no, we had very few. both of us once during the trip had to replace our rear wheel. The rims cracked, and we've since spoken to other people who've done more touring and know more about bikes, and they say if you're going to upgrade one thing, upgrade the strength of your wheels. But for 13,000 miles, that was fine. Replaced the chains and the cassettes a couple of times, and the tyres, we came with some stock tyres which got us to Turkey. Then we put Schwalbe Extreme Marathon Plus, and we've still got those in our garage 10,000 miles later. So beyond that, we had very few mechanical problems.
What was really interesting was that we used to do a lot of running, and we found that we just couldn't run. So when we got back, it was Christmas time, and on New Year's Day, 2 weeks after we got back, we went for a run, and we couldn't even do a mile because our legs were just so not used to walking or running anywhere. We were cycling fit. Stick us on a bike that's really heavily laden and ask us to go uphill, we could do that all day, but ask us to run fast for a bus, and we had no chance. So it was quite interesting.
It was really, you think we'd be super fit, but it was only in a particularly niche category of sport that we were fit. So I get that was it was obviously tiring, but it was one of the joys of the trip, is getting that much exercise every day. You have to eat as much as you want, and always sleeping well because you've done however many hours cycling. That was a real joy, and certainly miss that. And just have to make sure we cycle to work every day and take every opportunity that we can whilst we're working.
My thighs went really big. One of my best friends when we got back said, "God, Laura, your thighs really are big." And obviously it was meant as a compliment and taken as a compliment. It was quite a lot of work had gone into that.
The first thing to say, I think between us we crashed 5 times on the trip. I think I take credit for 4 of those, and vehicles can take credit for none of those. So all self-inflicted. Drivers really vary. Probably the US was probably the worst. Quite aggressive. Sometimes just, I suspect, didn't like cyclists would deliberately come near you or shout or honk their horns. But even there, it's a tiny minority. And other places like France, they're probably the friendliest drivers you'll ever get.
And the countries that we expected to be terrible for cycling ended up being the best. So actually India was an amazing country for cycling because the traffic's quite slow, and it's like this really complex dance. I mean, I think the road traffic accidents and the statistics for road traffic accidents in India is actually very high, but because there's cows and people and cyclists and rickshaws and motorbikes and cars and buses all in the traffic, all at the same time, all trying to go in the same direction, no one moves very fast, or at least not on the roads we were on. So we could just weave in and out, and it was like this sort of almost, I can only use the word dance because that's what it felt like sometimes, especially in the towns. In terms of dogs, we did have a dog dazer. So for those of you who don't know what a dog dazer is, it's a little tiny contraption about that big that you press, and it emits a very high-pitched noise, with the idea being that it scares dogs away because only dogs can hear it. And we didn't find it that effective, partly because if you're being chased by a dog, to have to then open your handlebar bag and rustle around for a dog dazer is not easy. We did try it, and I think that might have been the cause of one of the 5 crashes actually. Which is great when you're being chased by a dog. What we found to be the best strategy, we were chased by dogs a lot, particularly in Turkey and Greece, a hot tip for Greece. We found that the best strategy was to slow right down. It's very counterintuitive, but to slow right down, get off your bike, and then keep the bike between you and the dog. And the dog would usually stop. And if the dog didn't stop, then we would just usually pretend to throw something, and it would then usually stop. And then we never had to do this, but the last option was to throw a stone or something, and then it would turn tail. But we never actually got to that stage. It was almost always sort of the thrill of the chase that it wanted. So it took a long time to learn that. We didn't actually, no, not at all. No, we were pretty lucky in that respect.
Yeah. The only I've heard of that happening with, if you've got an Israeli stamp, apparently neighbouring Muslim countries don't always like it, but we didn't go there. And beyond that, no, I don't think anyone raised an eyebrow. I think in Oman, they took me to one side and asked me questions, but maybe that's just because I looked dodgy, or they just random spot check, but they let me through.
Just the only ones were Iran, India and Vietnam. That was it. Yeah, so very easy to sort of travel on the hoof, which suits us.
Very good of you to ask.
as it happens, a little sign here. Yeah, I've just spent the last 2.5 years writing this book, so it's been really difficult to find the time. I've had to be really disciplined, and I've set myself the goal of 4 hours every single week, either on my lunch break or in the evening. And every Sunday night, my friend would phone me up, who was writing a book as well, and we'd ask each other, how many hours have you done? How many hours have you done? Just to check. And it's felt like a real, like a labour of love. I've enjoyed it, but it's been really, really a long road. So 2.5 years of doing that, and just finished in time for this year's festival, which happened in May. And I self-published this time around, just printed 500 copies of the book. And if you'd like to buy it, you can obviously come up and grab one off me after we finished here, or if you can buy it on my website, and it's just about to go on Amazon as well. They're £10 for a paperback or £7 for an electronic version.